couple days ago, I got this sudden urge to head out on a solo camping trip. But like always, by the time I gathered my things and browsed through a few options, my finger hovering over the rideshare button to escape the city, it was already getting late. Actually, it was right around the time most people start wrapping up their day. I figured I had missed my window, but at about 5:45 p.m., a second wave of energy hit me. I figured I'd try something new, something a bit risky. I had always wondered about the idea of stealth camping. It's different from regular camping because instead of staying in a designated campsite, you find a spot to crash for the night in secret, sometimes behind big stores or tucked away between service stops, without anyone knowing you're there. With my mind made up, I grabbed my bicycle and pedaled toward Birchwood Preserve. I was on the lookout for a quiet spot among the trees where I could settle in without leaving a trace. I followed Maple Route 60 until I got near the Elmridge overpass. From there, I turned west and pushed into the thick, wild undergrowth. The path wasn't really a path. It was more like a tangle of thorns and tall weeds. I pushed through, eventually hiding my bike behind a patch of bushes. I made sure to drop a pin on my phone's map so I could find it again. So far, everything was going all right, and I felt a little more at ease. I usually expect things to go wrong, but nothing had yet, so I kept my hopes up. With my pack weighing heavy on my back, I trudged on, climbing a steep, crumbly slope. Soon the noise from passing cars faded away, replaced by the gentle sound of rustling branches and the calls of birds. Even though Birchwood Preserve is open to the public all year, with trails looping near nearby homes and RV neighborhoods, you can still find places where you feel totally alone. That's what I was looking for. As I went deeper, I spotted light tracks, probably deer, and also some old human boot prints. They didn't look fresh, likely from before the last rainfall. At one point, I almost stumbled over a pile of tossed-out clothes and beat-up shoes in shades of brown and green. Weird, but not too surprising in a place where all kinds of people come through. I moved past them, wanting to avoid running into anyone else. About a half-mile in, away from any trail, I came across two sturdy trees spaced just right. From there, I could see part of Dusk Ridge Bluff glowing orange as the sun dipped lower. It looked like a solid spot. I started setting up my hammock, though it took a frustrating amount of time to get the angle and straps just right. I'm not great with knots, and mosquitoes were already swarming, making things worse. Eventually, I crawled inside the netting and zipped it shut, finally starting to relax. That peace didn't last long. I kept hearing what sounded like twigs cracking and strange noises that could have been animals. I told myself it was nothing, branches falling or deer passing through. I tried to keep calm, but right when I was starting to drift off, I heard something I really didn't want to hear. Someone saying, "What are you doing here?" I shot up, startled, fumbling with my phone and dropping it. The voice belonged to a man stepping out of the shadows. He was tall, had tangled hair and a rough beard, and looked like he'd been outside for a long time. His whole vibe was off, not aggressive but far from friendly. "I didn't know anyone else was out here," I managed to say, not sure where this was headed. "This is my place," he said, motioning toward the trees behind him. "When are you leaving?" "First thing in the morning," I said quickly. "Just staying one night. That's it." I gave him a name, Mike, trying to sound casual and calm him down. "What's your name?" I asked. "I don't trust you," he said flatly. "How'd you even get through the barrier?" He kept going, mumbling something about a hidden shield. That's when I realized he wasn't thinking clearly. "I don't have to believe anything you say," he added. "But if you're dangerous, I'll end you." That line hit me hard. I was stuck, sitting in my hammock with no easy way out. "I'm just camping like you," I said quietly. He stared at me for a long second, then turned and walked up the hill without another word. "Good night," I called out behind him, but he didn't respond. After about 10 minutes of sitting there frozen, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up as quickly and quietly as I could, flicking on my flashlight and trying not to panic. As I stepped away from the trees, I heard him shout something from the darkness. "Don't mess with the barrier." A second later, something slammed into the side of my head. A sharp piece of metal. It gashed me open. Dizzy and bleeding, I didn't stop. I ran, unlocked my bike as fast as I could, and pedaled hard until I reached the main road. He didn't follow, but the whole thing left me badly shaken. Eventually, I made it home, my head pounding, and collapsed on the floor next to my cat, relieved to be somewhere safe. That night was definitely one of the scariest things I've been through while camping. It reminded me just how risky it can be when you step off the grid and into the unknown. Since then, I haven't attempted another stealth trip. That first one was more than enough. I had just turned 42 that fall and decided I needed a serious break from everything. After a long and brutal year working as a mechanical inspector in Chicago, where deadlines were tight, the boss was ruthless, and my nights were spent either staring at reports or just collapsing, I felt like my nerves had been worn down to threads. I wanted silence, space, and something that didn't involve screens or city noise. My kids were old enough to take care of themselves for a few days, and my ex-wife had them for the week anyway, so I finally had some freedom to breathe. I booked a small rental cabin through a local agency that specialized in remote places up north, closer to Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The photos showed a rustic one-bedroom log cabin with a stone fireplace and a wraparound porch tucked deep into a forested area near Millstone Ridge. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just me, trees, and silence. I couldn't think of anything more appealing. The drive up took me almost 9 hours. The final stretch was a narrow 2-lane road that curved endlessly, with tall pine and birch on both sides, until I finally reached the dirt road marked Millstone Trail. I followed it for maybe another 5 miles until the trees parted, revealing the cabin perched slightly above a rocky slope. Behind it, the ridge slanted upward and curved to form a kind of natural bowl, filled with dense timber and undergrowth. The air was crisp. The cabin sat in a clearing big enough for a gravel driveway, a woodpile, and a fire pit ringed with stones. No other buildings or signs of life were visible. The quiet was instant and total. Inside, the place was exactly what I'd hoped for, basic but sturdy. One big room held a bed against the back wall, a cast iron stove, a small dining table, and a counter with a propane-powered stove and sink. A ladder led to a low loft space above. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse about 20 feet behind the cabin through the trees. A big jug of potable water sat on the counter, and a plastic bin under the sink held extra. I'd brought more in the truck just in case. I unpacked quickly and checked the firewood supply, which was generous. I spent the rest of the day getting settled, chopping more wood, eating a sandwich on the porch, then starting a small fire as the sun went down. The night came fast, and with it an overwhelming stillness. It wasn't unsettling, just unfamiliar. I could hear my own breath clearly in the dark. That first night, I slept like I hadn't in months. I woke up after sunrise feeling like I'd finally hit some kind of internal reset button. The second day was easy. I went for a long walk around the ridge and explored a bit, following deer trails and animal tracks through the brush. At one point, I found an old logging road mostly swallowed by moss and saplings. A rusted soda can told me it hadn't been used in decades. When I climbed to the ridge's crest, the view opened up to a wide valley below, blanketed with trees turning gold and red. I sat for over an hour, just breathing and watching the wind ripple through the forest. I cooked that night, eggs and potatoes in the cast iron pan, and felt more peace than I had in years. I was fully alone, fully removed, no distractions. But that night, just as I was dozing off, I thought I heard something strange. It was faint, like a thump, then maybe another, a bit louder. At first, I thought it might be a deer stepping through the brush near the cabin. I sat up and listened. Nothing. Total silence again. After a while, I lay back down and told myself it was probably just a pine cone dropping on the roof, or maybe the wood settling in the cold. The next morning, I noticed something odd. A shallow groove in the dirt about 10 feet from the porch. It looked like something heavy had been dragged or scraped along the ground. But there were no boot prints or paw prints, nothing obvious. The ground was dry, so I figured it could have been an old rut I hadn't noticed earlier. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been close during the night. I tried to ignore it, I forced myself to go about my day, chopping more wood and hiking a different part of the ridge. But that afternoon, I had this strange sensation, like I was being watched. I'd pause and glance behind me, up into the trees, but nothing moved. The woods were still, even too still. I returned early, uneasy for no clear reason. Before going inside, I circled the cabin, scanning the woods. Everything looked normal. No sounds, no new tracks, no signs of animals or people. That night, the noise came again, louder, more distinct. It wasn't a thump. It was a scrape, long, slow, metal on wood. I bolted upright in bed and listened. Scrape, scrape, pause. It sounded like it came from the front porch. I climbed out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and crept toward the front window. I shined the beam outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. The trees were silent. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside in bare feet. The air was ice cold. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, but all it caught were shadows and trees. Then I saw it, near the corner of the porch. A deep gouge in the wooden planks. It hadn't been there before. It looked like someone had dragged a sharp metal edge, maybe an axe or blade, along the wood. But why? And who? I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat up in the corner with my flashlight and a hatchet I'd brought for splitting kindling. The next morning, I packed my bag. I didn't want to panic or run, but something was wrong. Maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe I wasn't alone out here like I thought. I decided I'd hike back to the old road and get a signal, try to call the rental company. I hadn't seen any other cabins nearby, but maybe there was a ranger station or small town within walking distance. I hiked for hours. I followed the same deer trail I'd taken before, then veered off toward the ridge's northern slope, where the forest opened a little. That's when I saw it. An old cabin, smaller than mine, almost hidden in the trees. Its roof was partly caved in, and the windows were shattered. Ivy had grown up the sides, and one of the doors hung crooked off its hinges. It didn't look occupied, but it had that same unnatural stillness I'd felt the night before. I stepped closer, cautiously. The ground near the front was disturbed. Not just disturbed. Asterisk flattened asterisk, like someone had recently been walking back and forth repeatedly. And at the base of the doorframe, embedded into the wood, was a deep, diagonal slash. I didn't go inside. I didn't want to know who or what had made that mark. I turned and left fast, hiking back to my cabin without stopping. That night, I didn't light a fire. I stayed inside with the curtains drawn. Just after midnight, I heard it again. The scraping. This time, it was on the back wall, right where the head of the bed rested. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then came the footsteps, slow, measured, crunching across the leaves behind the cabin. They circled once, then silence. I waited until morning, then ran to the truck. I threw everything inside, left half my gear behind, and tore down the dirt road without looking back. I didn't call the agency. I didn't complain or leave a review. I just went home and never spoke of it. But I still wonder who lived in that second cabin, and who, asterisk or what asterisk, was still out there, dragging something sharp across the wood, night after night. Jamie and I had been sneaking off to camp ever since college days, when exploring was cheaper than booking a motel and way more exciting. Over time, we got good at slipping quietly into nature's hidden corners. Forgotten patches of land, small parks, and green spaces. It became our way to travel light, save cash, and collect unusual memories. Honestly, the most frightening thing we ever ran into was a bold raccoon trying to steal our food. We were proud of being smart, careful, and above all, unseen. But there was one night, one moment that still gives me chills. We were on a road trip through the Cascades, planning to visit as many forests and natural parks as possible. Our days were spent hiking, resting by streams, and soaking in the wild beauty. At night, we always found a quiet, hidden place to camp. This night seemed no different. We rolled into a small town that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Broken shop windows, an old gas station, and houses with sagging roofs. It was late August, dry and warm, with a clear sky showing a handful of stars. Jamie suggested we check out a public park on the town's edge. From the road, it looked perfect. Tall pines, a creek running through it, and best of all, no other people around. We parked on a gravel patch near the entrance, grabbed our hammocks, and followed a thin path beside the creek. It led to a small clearing ringed by towering spruce trees. Their branches were thick, blocking most of the light and bathing everything in dark blues and deep shadows. The only sign of people was a crooked wooden fence, half rotten and tangled with vines. It seemed like it marked someone's land, but there were no lights or houses nearby. Maybe it was abandoned. Either way, it was far enough that we didn't worry. We set up our hammocks just off the path and settled in for a quiet night. After a quick cold meal of sandwiches and fruit, I lay back in the larger hammock, watching stars peek through the gaps in the branches. The only sounds were the creek's soft murmur, rustling leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful. Stealth camping was second nature by then, so I didn't think much of it. But at some point, I must have drifted off because when I woke, it was dark. At first, I thought I heard something faint and out of place. I stayed still, listening. All I could hear were the usual night sounds. But before I could brush it off, Jamie whispered beside me, "Do you hear that?" I nodded, even though I hadn't caught anything specific. His voice was low and tense, the kind that makes your nerves jump. "What is it?" I whispered, barely daring to breathe. "I've been hearing footsteps for a while." That caught my attention. I focused hard and finally heard it too. Faint shuffling, like someone dragging their feet slowly and deliberately. It wasn't an animal. My heart started pounding as I scanned the dark around us. The trees threw long moving shadows, and in the dim light through the branches, I saw something. A figure stumbling between the trees. It was an old woman. Her hair was wild and tangled, and her clothes hung loosely like rags. She moved strangely, erratically stepping forward then doubling back, her arms limp at her sides. At first, I thought she was lost, maybe wandered off somewhere. But there was something off about her movements, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. We lay still, not daring to make a sound, watching her stagger closer. Her face was hard to make out in the dim light. I held my breath, hoping she'd just pass by and leave us alone. But instead, she stopped near one of the bigger trees. She looked around nervously, then crouched down like she wanted to hide. Pressing herself against the trunk, she went completely still. We lost sight of her. The silence that followed felt suffocating. My mind raced, trying to figure out what we had just seen. Who was she? Why was she out there in the middle of the night acting like that? More importantly, where was she now? I couldn't shake the feeling she was still out there, watching us just beyond our sight. Minutes dragged by. The tension in the air felt thick enough to choke on. Jamie's grip on my arm tightened. I could tell he was just as scared as I was, but neither of us moved. We waited, hoping she'd disappear. Then suddenly, there was more movement, heavier, louder. Two men walked into the park, heading toward the trees like they knew exactly where they were going. They wore dark, rough clothes, and their walk was full of purpose and intent. My stomach twisted with dread. They weren't just out for a stroll. They were hunting for something or someone. Jamie and I huddled together, barely daring to peek over the edge of the hammock as they neared the tree where the old woman had hidden. I heard them muttering to each other, low and urgent, like they were arguing. One raised a hand, pointed at the tree, then they started beating the bushes and kicking at the undergrowth while whispering. I clamped my hand over my mouth, terrified to make a sound. Finally, after what felt like forever, one of them barked an order, and the old woman crawled out of her hiding spot. Up close, she looked even more helpless. Her body shook as she pulled herself to her feet. One of the men grabbed her arm and yanked her up, almost throwing her off balance. They didn't seem to care. One of them slapped her hard on the side of the head, making her stumble. She didn't scream, just flinched and kept her head down. "Stay in line this time," one of them said, his voice harsh and cruel. They marched her back the way they came, forcing her to stay between them as they moved deeper into the park. They paused and scanned the area, their eyes sweeping over the trees, bushes, and us. I felt their gaze like a blade even from a distance. They weren't searching for something or someone specific. They were making sure no one was watching. Then their eyes landed on our hammock. For a moment, my heart stopped. They stared at it, whispering to each other again. I thought they would come over and check it out, but after a tense exchange, they shrugged it off and kept walking, leading the old woman deeper into the woods. We stayed frozen, barely breathing, until we were sure they were gone. My mind was racing with questions and no good answers. Who were those men? What were they doing with her? Why were they dragging her around like that in the middle of the night? As soon as they vanished from sight, Jamie and I scrambled to pack up our camp. Our hands shook as we moved. We didn't say a word, not a single word. I didn't even dare turn on a flashlight, expecting them to come back and find us. My chest tightened with fear. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I'd never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. We ran back to the trail, and suddenly the night felt menacing instead of peaceful. When we finally reached our car, Jamie fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before unlocking the door. We jumped inside, locked the doors, and sped off as if our lives depended on it. It wasn't until we were halfway down the highway that we dared to speak. We agreed we had to report what happened. I don't know what I expected when I called the local sheriff's office, but their response was disappointing. The dispatcher took down our info and said someone would look into it. That was it, no follow-up, no questions. It felt like they were used to hearing stories like ours, like it was just another case in a long list. We didn't wait around to find out. We drove until we reached the next town and found a cheap motel. That night, we lay awake, replaying everything in our heads, trying to understand it. The more we thought about it, the more disturbing it became. The old woman's hollow eyes, the way she moved like a puppet on worn-out strings, the cruelty of those two men. It was a nightmare come to life, one we barely could process. What haunted us wasn't just the oddness of what we saw, but what it meant. What if we hadn't stayed quiet? What if we tried to help or even just made noise? Those men weren't there to help her. They were controlling her in some way. Who knows what they planned or how many others they'd hurt. The thought of being caught in their path made my skin crawl. When my spouse and I were newly married, we used to take trips down to Georgia once or twice a year, usually during the milder seasons. The warm weather and chance to get out on the water with our paddleboards kept us going back. We'd both grown up on the Pacific side of the country, where we learned to surf as kids, but we didn't actually meet until years later when we both ended up working in the Great Lakes region. Even though we were far from the coast, we still missed being on the water, so these trips became our fix. Since neither of us had any close relatives or longtime friends in Georgia, these getaways became our own kind of escape. We craved the coast, the taste of fresh seafood, and the warmth of the sun. Without obligations to visit anyone, we made a point to pick a new coastal town every trip, never going to the same place twice. Kept things exciting. We were both in our mid-20s at the time and didn't have a lot of money to spare. Our savings were pretty small, so we had to be smart with how we spent. That meant no hotels and avoiding motels along the way. Instead, we relied on our hatchback, which had just enough room in the back for sleeping bags and supplies. It saved us hundreds. It was actually my spouse's idea to stick to a tight travel budget, and I was completely on board. I've always liked being outside, so when she brought up the idea of camping, I was all in. But this wasn't your usual campsite setup she was talking about. Around 2004 or so, not many people were doing what's now called stealth camping. We'd heard about it from someone she worked with, a guy who had biked across the country. He explained how, on long rides, cyclists had to find places to crash wherever they could, whether that meant a quiet park or a less obvious parking lot. They traveled light and picked up supplies when needed, carrying just the basics. A tarp, sunshade, multi-tool, and the like. We thought it sounded like an adventure and decided to try it on one of our Georgia trips. We packed our hatchback with things we thought would help. Small but useful stuff like extra string, matches, trash bags, batteries, and a couple of flashlights. We kept everything tucked away neatly so the car still looked normal. For sleeping, we laid down foam pads and blankets, and my spouse even made little curtains to hang around the inside of the car for privacy. For almost 4 years, this kind of urban-style camping worked great. We never had a major problem. The only thing that ever gave us trouble was finding good parking spots. A lot of the beach towns had pretty tight rules about sleeping overnight in public areas, especially close to the water or near stores. That meant we had to get creative, finding places where people left their cars overnight, usually residential streets, which weren't always easy to find in smaller beach communities. But somehow, we always figured it out. We'd spend a couple of nights in one area, clean up in public beach restrooms or community showers, and then head home. It was simple and it worked. But there was one trip that shook us up enough to make us change our whole approach. On this trip, our first night in a new coastal town didn't go smoothly. We drove around for hours trying to find a decent street to park on. Every road we tried either had signs saying no overnight parking or just didn't feel right. By the time we found a quiet spot near a few houses, we were both wiped out. We parked at the very end of the road where the streetlights stopped and the pavement disappeared into trees. We started going through our usual bedtime routine, washing up with bottled water, brushing our teeth with a little cup, setting up the bed in the back. Just when we were starting to settle in, we heard voices and footsteps somewhere behind us. A car had parked about 60 or 70 yards back, but it didn't stay long. After a few minutes, it pulled away, leaving just one other car parked farther down the road. Even though we were both a little uneasy, we were too tired to start driving again. We sat for a moment, thinking about whether we should leave. That's when we noticed headlights in the opposite direction. I peeked out from behind our makeshift curtain and saw an old, beat-up van pulling over across from us, maybe 25 yards away. Right away, I got this sinking feeling in my chest. My spouse noticed it too and made a quick comment about the van having a strange vibe. But she reminded me that the whole point of stealth camping was to stay hidden and avoid drawing attention, and then she laid down to sleep. Couldn't relax though. Something felt wrong. I kept watch from behind the curtain. Inside the van, I could see someone sitting in the front seat, smoking a cigarette and staring right at our car. I whispered to my wife that I'd stay up for a bit and keep an eye on things. She nodded and closed her eyes. I stayed still, my eyes locked on the tiny orange glow of the cigarette. Time passed slowly. After about 30 minutes, I decided to make some instant coffee to help myself stay alert. I quietly stepped out and set up our little camp stove near the bumper, trying to act casual but keeping one eye on the van the whole time. Then, the driver got out and started walking toward me. His hands kept fidgeting, and he asked if I had any matches. I handed him a couple without saying much. My heart was pounding, but I tried to keep calm. I made sure the knife in my coat pocket was within easy reach. He didn't stay long, just chatted briefly, then walked back to his van. I hoped that was the end of it, but right after that, someone else stepped out from the trees near the van. A much bigger man who silently climbed into the passenger side. That's when I hit the car's headlights. Both men turned their heads and stared at us through the beams. I jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine without saying a word. My wife sat up instantly. We drove off without looking back, heading straight into town and finding a spot near a well-lit gas station. We stayed there the rest of the night, wide awake. That morning, we made a decision. As much as we'd enjoyed our years of stealth camping, we realized the risks weren't worth it anymore. From then on, we started budgeting a little more for motels or small cabins whenever we went on trips. Sleeping in a car might have saved us money, but after that night, we knew it was time to stop pushing our luck. A few years have passed since then, and we still talk about that night sometimes. We never figured out what those two men were doing, or if they even noticed us specifically. But the feeling we got, the tension, the fear, the way it all unfolded, was enough to make us change the way we travel for good. Her relative lived somewhere in the upper East Coast of the US. We were a couple in our late 40s, not elderly but not young either, so getaways like this had become a regular part of our lifestyle. Lately, we'd been hearing more and more about this thing called stealth camping. The idea made us laugh because we'd kind of already been doing it for years, traveling through different towns and states. We got hooked on the videos people posted online, creative setups, daring spots, unusual methods. Some were smart and resourceful, while others were just risky stunts made for attention. A few people even camped in high-crime areas or without any sort of shelter or car. Despite how wild some of it looked, we found ourselves drawn in and eventually added stealth camping to our own travels. At first, we kept it easy, just sleeping in our SUV in big box store parking lots. But over time, we pushed things a bit further. We stopped using big store lots like Target or similar places. Instead, we started scouting out quiet apartment complexes or gated communities. We'd trail behind a resident's car to slip through the gate, then park in an empty space and stay the night. Come morning, we'd quietly slip out, acting like we belonged there. It became a kind of game for us, an exciting one. Stealth camping is different from the kind of off-grid camping we'd done before, where we stayed on open land without any services. This was more about staying low-key inside city areas, making our car a hidden little shelter. It wasn't about roughing it, but about being discreet and mobile. After a year of testing things out, we decided to take it a step further. During a visit to my partner's cousin, we planned to set up a tiny tent setup outside, still inside the city limits. We'd watched enough videos and had built up enough know-how to give it a try. Looking back now, it was your typical midlife boredom moment. The first few nights went without any issues. We camped successfully 3 or 4 times. Then one night, in a busy city, we had to be extra careful about where to park. After eating dinner and walking around a bit, we found a narrow wooded strip behind a grocery store. There was an old fence with no signs posted. The area had some trees and a little rise in the ground that gave us some cover. It looked like the perfect hidden place for our next attempt. We couldn't set up right away. We needed the lot below to clear out and darkness to fall. So we ran a few errands, stocked up on snacks and bottled water, then came back when it was dark enough and the lot was nearly empty. We pitched our tent halfway up the hill, surrounded by trees. The dark color of the tent blended in well with the scenery. The area up there was mostly flat, perfect for setting up our small folding cot. That cot was a lifesaver, way better than sleeping on the ground, especially with our stiff backs. Once everything was ready, we relaxed with some trail mix, soft conversation, and a bit of internet browsing while looking at the stars. The distant hum of a nearby freeway became a sort of background noise, oddly peaceful. Suddenly, the peace was broken by tires screeching below. A car started spinning and drifting around the lot. We just hoped it wouldn't crash into our vehicle, which was parked down there among a few others. The noise died down after a bit, and we figured that was it for the night. Darkness can wear you out, and even though it was still fairly early, I was ready to crawl into bed. We began folding up our camp chairs when we heard the car return, this time louder. It came to a hard stop with tires screaming. We looked at each other, instantly uneasy. Then we heard car doors open and voices follow. 2 men climbed through the fence into the strip of woods we were hiding in. Their voices weren't friendly. They were talking about drugs and things that sounded violent. I saw my partner tense up, but I signaled her to stay completely still. Our best defense was staying quiet and hidden. Any noise might give us away. The 2 men, who I'll call Quick Mouth and Big Talk, stopped near a downed tree not far below our tent. Quick Mouth talked fast, sometimes rambling, while Big Talk was loud and arrogant. They started discussing why they were there. Apparently, they were planning to rob someone, a dealer, based on their words. Prices were up, service was bad, and they figured they'd trick him out of his supply. We had no choice but to stay frozen. Soon, we heard more footsteps. A 3rd man arrived, the one they meant to rip off. But instead of walking into a trap, he pulled out a gun. The surprise twist? Quick Mouth had set up Big Talk. The whole thing had been a setup, but against one of their own. Things got worse fast. Big Talk was tied up and robbed. We stayed perfectly still, hoping not to get caught in the mess. Then it happened. My partner, who suffers from serious allergies, sneezed loudly. All 3 men froze and looked up toward us. We didn't move a muscle. They didn't come up the hill, but they definitely noticed something was there. They shouted angry threats in our direction, cursed us, then went back through the fence, leaving Big Talk behind. We waited, completely silent. Once Big Talk finally limped away and we were sure they were all gone, we packed up everything as fast as we could. We got in the car, drove off, and once we were far enough away, we called the local authorities. That night didn't scare us away from stealth camping for good, but it changed how we approached it. We were much more careful afterward, and much smarter about where we chose to hide out. In the end, we didn't give it up, we just got better at it. Riding coast to coast, we gave some lazy, half-serious answers. To tell the truth, I barely remember what we even talked about. We just kept drinking, glass after glass, until we were all red-faced, sweating, and chuckling like idiots. By around 2 in the morning, none of us could stay upright anymore. The guy running the place, a cowboy type, told us he had to lock up by law. Didn't matter much. We were too far gone to care. We just dropped where we stood and knocked out on the floor. One by one, the rough-looking locals we'd been drinking with said their goodbyes and trickled out. Only the bartender stayed behind for a few more minutes. He locked the place as he left and said he'd be back in the morning. We passed out instantly. I don't even recall hearing anyone come back inside. Sometime during the night, I woke up to the floor slightly shaking. Someone was walking around. At first, I figured it was one of the guys getting up to piss, but when I looked, they were all still passed out near me. Whoever was moving had boots on. We'd all taken ours off. "Hey!" I called. From across the dark room, I heard the cowboy's voice. "Evening, fellas." A beam of blinding light hit me straight in the face, then swept down over me. It stunned me for a second. I tried to sit up, wondering if it was already morning. My buddies were stirring too, shielding their eyes and trying to see. "What the hell?" Brandon muttered. "He's not wearing anything." We all looked, and yeah, there he was, standing there in nothing but his boots and hat. I checked my watch. Barely an hour had gone by. He must have come back smashed, taken off his clothes, and for whatever weird reason, decided to act out. "Come on, let's have some real fun," he slurred. "Nope," I yelled. We all scrambled, trying to grab our things as fast as we could. Luckily, he was too hammered to even stay balanced. We shoved everything into our bags, slung them over our backs, grabbed the bikes, and bolted. Outside, his truck was still running. Headlights shining, driver's door wide open, engine humming. Totally insane. We didn't waste a second. Just got on our bikes and pedaled away. It was harder than we thought. We were still pretty buzzed. Our bags slipping off, tires wobbling. We weren't getting far very fast. We hadn't even gone a full mile when we rolled into a clearing with an old, falling apart barn. The place looked abandoned. Inside was moldy hay, busted farm tools, rusted junk. We dragged our bikes around to the back, climbed into the loft, and tried to sleep. Didn't really work. We drifted in and out, half dozing, until the sky started to lighten. Right after sunrise, we spotted a pickup creeping along the back roads nearby. Pretty sure it was him again, driving slow like he was checking every corner. We didn't hang around to be sure. We grabbed our gear, got on the bikes, and rode out fast, sticking to back paths and dodging open roads. After that, we kept a low profile for the rest of the trip, avoiding people whenever we could. Between the college I was studying at and my parents' house, the trip usually took about 20 hours. Right around the halfway mark sat a small town in Utah. I'd driven through it before but never made a stop, even though I'd heard it was a popular place for people who loved hiking, climbing, and being outside. I'd grown up doing a lot of hiking, so I was curious to check out what the place had to offer for someone just passing by. At the time, I was still a student trying to save money on my first break home, so I wanted to avoid spending on things I didn't need, including a hotel. The plan was pretty straightforward. Sleep a few hours in my old SUV, and then get back on the road. The area seemed like it would be okay for that kind of thing, so I figured finding a safe place wouldn't be a problem. When the day came, I packed up my car and drove straight until the sun started to go down. That put me about halfway there. As it got darker, I was reaching the edges of the town. The land was open and dry, not much plant life, definitely not forested. but since I was going to sleep in the car, that didn't matter much to me. By the time I got into town, it was fully dark. This was back in 2004, before smartphones had maps, so all I had were directions I'd printed out beforehand. I found a camping spot listed on the paper, just a few miles past town near a river. But when I got there, I realized it was a paid site and didn't allow overnight stays unless you had a reservation or permit. Within minutes of pulling in, a few other campers came up to me with flashlights, asking to see proof that I'd paid. After a few of those encounters, I started to feel out of place and figured I should leave. I didn't want to bother anyone or get into trouble, so I turned around and headed back toward town. I thought I could just park somewhere like a diner or grocery store and sleep there, but every place I tried had sketchy people hanging around, and the vibe made me uneasy. I didn't feel safe at all. Eventually, I gave up and drove out of town a little ways until I found a dirt path that went off the main road. I followed it until I came to a small ridge where I could park with some cover. I hung up a blanket over the inside of my windows for a bit of privacy and tried to get comfortable. It wasn't ideal, but I hoped I could get a few hours of sleep. By around 9 p.m., I had settled in and planned to get a little rest before sunrise. I figured I'd wash up early and hit the road again. But sometime before morning, I woke up to the sound of a loud engine. I looked out through a small gap in the blanket and saw a big truck sitting there. The driver was just staring at my vehicle. After a few moments, he pulled away. I assumed it was someone who had just turned down the wrong road or maybe was curious. I laid back down and tried to rest again. Not long after that, a loud thumping on my window snapped me fully awake. I thought maybe it was police checking on me, but when I looked, I saw a dented old pickup and a man trying to look inside. A second later, another guy slammed his fist on the back window. It hit me quickly that I was surrounded. I didn't know what to do, but decided to step out and try to explain I was just passing through and sleeping in my car. That turned out to be a mistake. As soon as I got out, they grabbed me, forced me down to the ground, and started digging through my vehicle. I kept trying to explain myself, hoping they'd listen, but they laughed it off, ignored me, and kept taking things, whatever they could find of value. As the sun started to rise, the sound of traffic off in the distance seemed to make them uneasy. After a few minutes that felt like an hour, they told me not to follow them or call anyone. Then they jumped in their truck and sped off, disappearing down the road. I was shaken, but thankfully not physically hurt. I got back into the SUV and looked around. Most of my stuff was gone, anything they thought was worth taking, but the car still ran. I drove back into town and made my way to the local police department to report what happened. At first, the officers didn't take me too seriously, but when I told them where it happened, they got more interested. Turns out, those two men had been causing problems for a while, sneaking onto nearby properties and stealing from farms and ranches in the area. With the details I gave them, the police managed to find where the guys had been staying, some kind of rough camp hidden out of sight, later that same day. In the end, I didn't lose a lot of expensive stuff. What I lost didn't really matter much, but what stuck with me was the fear and the helplessness. That experience changed how I travel. I've never tried stealth camping again. Not worth the risk,